and welcome to Slow Thoughts in English. My name is Adam, and the person sitting with me today is Rachel. On this channel, we don't rush, we don't oversimplify, and we don't turn feelings into mysteries. We slow things down, and we explain them clearly. Today's topic is when you don't feel like talking. Not as a personality trait, not as a problem, but as a process. Part 1. Why we lose the desire to speak. Most people think silence comes from emotion, from sadness, from anger, from conflict. But in reality, the most common cause of silence is overload. Not emotional overload, mental overload. Throughout the day, we explain ourselves. We adjust our tone. We respond politely. We stay alert. At work, we speak carefully. We choose words that won't cause friction. At home, we retell our day. We listen. We respond again. The brain does not rest between these moments. It keeps processing. Eventually, the system reaches capacity. And when that happens, the brain looks for the fastest way to reduce effort. That way is silence.
Yes, and what makes this difficult is that the work is invisible. You're not doing something physical. You're not clearly busy, but you are constantly regulating yourself. Your facial expression, your tone, your reactions. You are always adjusting. Over time, this kind of regulation drains energy. So when people say, "I don't feel like talking today," what they often mean is, "I don't have the energy to regulate myself anymore." They don't want to manage reactions. They don't want to explain context. They don't want to perform connection. They just want the input to stop.
Another important cause is unfinished communication. We carry conversations that never ended, emails that required more explanation, meetings that raised questions but didn't resolve anything, small moments where we wanted to speak but didn't. The brain keeps these open loops active. Even when we are quiet, the processing continues. So by the end of the day, the desire to talk is gone. Not because there's nothing inside, but because there's too much.
There's also emotional compression. We compress feelings to stay functional. We don't react immediately. We don't express fully. We postpone emotional responses. This is necessary to function, but compressed emotion still uses energy. It doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And when accumulation reaches a limit, the system shuts down expression. Not permanently, temporarily. Silence becomes a form of protection.
The problem is not the silence itself. The problem is how silence is interpreted. People assume silence is intentional, or emotional, or personal. But most silence is neither. It's physiological. It's cognitive. It's the brain saying, "I need fewer inputs before I can produce output again." Understanding this changes everything.
When we don't understand the cause, we respond incorrectly. We push ourselves to speak. We explain too much, or we disappear completely. And that creates new problems. In the next part, we'll talk about the effects, what actually happens when silence appears, and why it creates tension even when no one did anything wrong.
Not wanting to talk is not a personality flaw. It's a signal. And before we try to fix the silence, we need to understand why it appeared in the first place. That's where clarity begins. Part 2. What silence actually does to relationships and to us. When silence appears, the first thing that changes is not the relationship. It's the interpretation. Silence creates a gap, and humans are very uncomfortable with gaps. When there is no explanation, the mind fills it automatically. At work, silence becomes, "Something is wrong." In relationships, it becomes, "They're pulling away." Inside ourselves, it becomes, "I'm doing something wrong." But silence itself is neutral. It only becomes a problem when meaning is assigned to it without evidence. And that is where tension begins.
I notice that when I'm quiet, people often react before they ask. They change their tone, they become careful, sometimes they become distant. Not because I did anything, but because they are responding to their own interpretation. That's when silence starts to feel heavy. Not because I'm tired anymore, but because now I feel responsible for how others are feeling. I wasn't trying to send a message, but suddenly my silence has become one.
This creates a chain reaction. Silence leads to interpretation. Interpretation leads to assumption. Assumption leads to emotional response. And none of this requires bad intentions. Everyone involved is trying to protect themselves. The quiet person is conserving energy. The other person is seeking reassurance. But because silence is unclear, both sides feel slightly unsafe. That's why silence, when misunderstood, can slowly damage connection even when no one meant harm.
There's also an internal effect that people rarely talk about. When I stay quiet for too long, without understanding why, I start judging myself. I think, why can't I just talk? Why am I like this? That self-judgment adds another layer to the tiredness. Now I'm not only exhausted, I'm also disappointed in myself. And that disappointment makes it even harder to speak. Silence feeds silence.
This is where many people make a mistake. They try to fix the effect instead of the cause. They force conversation. They over-explain. They perform normalcy. But forced communication does not rebuild connection. It drains energy faster. Talking without capacity creates resentment. Listening without presence creates distance. The effect is not resolution. The effect is deeper exhaustion.
I've noticed that silence also changes how we see ourselves socially. When we don't feel like talking, we often withdraw a little. We attend fewer conversations. We respond more briefly. And then we start thinking, am I becoming distant? Am I losing connection with people? That fear is powerful. But the truth is, temporary silence does not erase connection. Unacknowledged silence does. The problem isn't quiet. The problem is confusion.
So let's be precise here. The effect of silence is not damage. It is uncertainty. Uncertainty in others, uncertainty in ourselves, and uncertainty always seeks resolution. If silence has no structure, people create their own explanations. That's why silence needs clarity, not volume. It needs context, not performance.
Once I understood this, something changed for me. I stopped trying to sound normal, and I stopped disappearing completely. Instead, I focused on reducing uncertainty, not by talking more, but by signaling clearly. A simple sentence, a calm tone, a boundary without drama. That small change completely altered how silence was received.
And this leads directly to the next part of the process. When silence appears and the effects become uncomfortable, we usually react in predictable ways. We either force speech or we withdraw fully. In the next part, we'll talk about those behaviors, why we do them, why they fail, and how to respond differently. Silence itself is not the problem. Misunderstood silence is. And once we understand the effects, we can finally choose a response that protects both our energy and our relationships. Part 3. What we usually do when silence feels uncomfortable, and why it fails. When silence becomes uncomfortable, most people don't stay still. They react. Not because they want to, but because uncertainty creates pressure. The mind wants resolution. The body wants relief. So we move, we speak, we withdraw, we overcompensate. These reactions feel natural, but most of them don't solve the problem.
I've noticed that when I don't feel like talking, my first instinct is to pretend. I smile. I respond quickly. I say things that sound normal. Not because I feel present, but because I don't want questions. I don't want to explain my silence. I don't want to create concern. So I talk. But the talking feels empty, like words leaving my mouth without passing through me. After those conversations, I feel more tired than before. Pretending costs energy.
This is the first common behavior, forced communication. People speak without capacity. They answer messages they don't want to answer. They join conversations they can't focus on. The goal is not connection. The goal is avoidance, avoiding misunderstanding, avoiding tension, avoiding explanation. But forced communication doesn't reduce pressure. It delays it, and delayed pressure usually returns stronger.
The second behavior is the opposite, complete withdrawal. No replies, no explanations, no signals. At first, this feels relieving. The input stops, the noise fades, but soon another feeling appears: guilt. I start wondering what people are thinking. I imagine the messages I didn't answer. That guilt creates tension. And now, silence is no longer restful. It's defensive.
The third behavior is over-explaining. People sense misunderstanding, so they try to prevent it. They explain their mood, their energy, their intentions. They talk too much to protect the relationship. But over-explaining creates a new problem. It turns silence into a performance. Now you're not resting. You're managing perception. That management uses the same energy silence was supposed to save.
I've done all three: pretending, disappearing, over-explaining, and none of them worked for long, because they all ignore the real issue. The issue isn't communication. The issue is capacity. When capacity is low, any behavior that increases output will fail.
Here's the important distinction. Silence feels uncomfortable not because it's wrong, but because it's unclear. So people try to replace silence with something familiar: talking, explaining, withdrawing. But clarity doesn't require volume, it requires structure.
Once I understood that, I stopped asking, "How do I talk more?" And I started asking, "How do I signal clearly without draining myself?" That question changed everything, because it didn't demand energy, it demanded intention.
Most unhealthy behaviors around silence come from fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being seen as distant, fear of damaging connection. But reacting from fear creates unstable solutions. In the next part, we'll talk about response, not reaction. A response that protects energy and keeps connection intact. When silence appears, doing more is not always better. Sometimes doing less, but doing it clearly, is the healthiest move. Part 4. How to use silence intentionally without breaking connection. A healthy response to silence starts with one important shift. We stop asking, "How do I explain myself?" And we start asking, "How do I reduce uncertainty without draining my energy?" That question changes the direction completely. because the goal is no longer to perform communication. The goal is to create clarity.
For a long time, I thought silence had to be justified. That if I didn't talk, I owed people a reason. But silence doesn't need justification. It needs framing. Once I understood that, I stopped disappearing. And I stopped over-explaining. Instead, I started using small signals. Simple, honest, limited.
Intentional silence has three components. First, acknowledgement. Second, boundary. Third, time. Acknowledgement tells people, I'm present. Boundary tells people, I'm limited. Time tells people, this is temporary. You don't need emotion. You don't need detail. You need structure.
For example, instead of saying nothing, I say, I'm low on energy today. Or, I need some quiet time. That's it. No story, no emotional explanation, no apology. Those sentences do three things. They reduce uncertainty. They protect my energy. They keep the relationship intact.
Notice what's missing. There is no justification, no emotional defense, no over-clarification. That's intentional. Because once you start defending silence, it stops being silence. It becomes negotiation, and negotiation is exhausting.
At first, this felt uncomfortable. I worried people would think I was distant, or cold, or uninterested. But something surprising happened. Most people adjusted. Not immediately, but gradually. Because clarity builds trust. Unclear silence creates anxiety. Clear silence creates stability.
This is where many people get it wrong. They think intentional silence pushes people away. But in reality, it filters relationships. People who respect boundaries stay. People who rely on constant access become uncomfortable. And that information is valuable.
I learned that I don't need everyone to understand my silence. I need a few people to respect it. When silence is used intentionally, it stops feeling like withdrawal. It feels like self-regulation. And that changes how I return. I come back clearer, less defensive, more present.
Let's be clear about the process. Cause, overload. Effect, misunderstanding. Behavior, forcing speech or disappearing. Response, clear, limited, intentional silence. When silence is framed correctly, it stops being a problem. It becomes a tool.
Not wanting to talk is not something to fix. It's something to listen to. When you respond with clarity, not pressure, silence becomes safe. And when silence is safe, connection doesn't break. It rests. And when it returns stronger.
Thank you for listening to Slow Thoughts in English. Sometimes the most responsible response is not to speak. It's to pause with intention.